Hello, and welcome to part two of the Devil's Backbone, where we will be going now below the surface of the historical events that we discussed and looking at the astrology of them, the context of those transits, some that are, happening again now currently, and kind of what that means, as history does not repeat itself so much as it rhymes, as they say. Um, so now that we know, like I said, the history, the question becomes what was moving beneath? What pressures turned old contradictions into now open rupture? What changed when the country could no longer disguise captivity as compromise or violence as unity? And to answer that, we have to look beneath the national mythology and into its astrological backbone. A time when crossed from Pisces in or Neptune in Pisces crossed into Aries, and Uranus crossed from Taurus into Gemini, a lie that had expanded beyond containment and contradiction moved towards civil war. Those planets have crossed those thresholds again. With this, I want to establish an important boundary. Astrology does not tell us, like I said, that history repeats itself. This is not, prophetic doom porn, so to speak. It's just to give context to some of the similar energies, um, as well as to reveal that this is something that has been going on since the birth of this nation. It's not something that is new. Um, so the last Mars Uranus conjunction was in 1947 and aligned with the formation of the CIA, which could be argued was pivotal in both the founding of Israel and by extension Mossad, sparks of the Cold War, and the partition of India and Pakistan. And even in relatively our lifetime, some people from them are still alive now. It's not necessarily cannons firing, and war came after a war, essentially that time. Um, Thus, the return of an outer planet um, does not mean the same events must happen again. Neptune entering Aries does not guarantee another civil war. Uranus entering Gemini does not require the United States to divide into two governments. In fact, I would argue this time it is exposing a single party masking as two parties, masking as choice. A Mars Uranus conjunction does not promise a specific tack, uprising, or technological disaster. They do return us to familiar energies. The people change, the technology changes, yet the questions can return: who belongs to the nation? Who is protected by its laws? Who controls the land, the labor, and the resources? Who has the authority to define reality, essentially? And what happens when political opponents no longer merely disagree, but begin to see one another as inhabitants of entirely different countries, different existences? And what happens when rhetoric ceases to describe violence and begins preparing people to commit it? Those are the questions linking the 1850s to the transits unfolding around us now. For the planetary dates and positions in this episode, I am using the Tropical Zodiac and Swiss Ephemeris, a high precision planetary calculation system developed by astrodynamists and based substantially upon NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So there are two outer planet stories running through this period. The first belongs to Neptune. Neptune moved through Pisces during the decades leading to the Civil War. It entered Aries as the war began. The second belongs to Uranus, which moved through Taurus as the conflict centered around land ownership, territorial expansion, and the legal treatment of human bodies as property. It crossed the final decan of Taurus and the fixed star Algol during some of the decade's most graphic eruptions of political violence. Then Uranus entered Gemini. The struggle moved from the plains of Kansas into speeches, newspapers, court opinions, party platforms, election campaigns, and competing definitions of the nation itself. Neptune in Pisces dissolved the national myth. Uranus in Taurus destabilized the material system beneath the myth. Uranus in Gemini fractured the language through which the country understood itself, a house divided, two truths occupying the same space. Then Neptune entered Aries, and the competing stories became causes people were willing to don uniforms and kill and die for. Now, more than a century and a half later, Neptune has completed another transit of Pisces and moved into Aries. Uranus has completed another passage through late Taurus and Algol and has begun entering Gemini, or is in Gemini. Now, at this point, the United States and Israel bombed Iran while Uranus was conjunct Algol back in February. There is a whole episode I did on Algol called Heads Will Roll. Check it out. I think it's very fascinating. And of course, on July 4th, Mars will conjoin Uranus and Gemini on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. This is also the home of the U.S. natal Mars and Uranus, though they aren't conjunct there. So let us return to the beginning, not the beginning of the history this time, the beginning of the astrological pattern. The transits leading into the Civil War activated these exact parts of the chart. Neptune moved through Pisces, the fourth whole sign house of land, roots, ancestry, and the foundation of the country. It dissolved the story that the nation shared one home and one identity. Then Neptune crossed the Sibley's chart of Coli, the deepest root of the chart, and entered Aries as Fort Sumter surrendered. The crisis buried beneath the national home emerged as open action. Uranus moved through Taurus, the sixth whole sign house, the house of labor, work, servitude, bodies used to maintain the system, health, and survival. During that transit, the country was forced to confront whether human beings could be owned as labor and whether that ownership could be carried into new land. Uranus crossed the third decan of Taurus in the fixed star Algol as the conflict entered bodies through beatings, executions, and massacres. A nation, families, lives, all severed. Then Uranus entered Gemini, the seventh whole sign house of treaties, opponents, and open enemies. It approached its return to its natal position. The United States experienced its first Uranus return as the old political order broke apart and the country moved towards civil war. And recently, the United States has completed its first Pluto return. Natal Pluto sits in Capricorn in the second whole sign house of wealth, resources, ownership, and national value. The Pluto return has excavated the power beneath the American economy. Who owns the housing, the land, the courts? Who owns the technology, the data, and the communication networks? Whose labor is considered essential? Whose survival is treated as an acceptable expense? Mars and Uranus will conjoin in the Sibley chart's seventh whole sign house, the territory of allies, adversaries, agreements, and open conflict. The conjunction occurs on America's birthday while the country is performing its own origin story through speeches, ceremonies, military display, flags, and fireworks. And Mercury will be retrograde in Cancer, returning to the degree of America's natal Mercury and reactivating its opposition to Pluto. The words of the founding will be pulling back into the argument over power. Saturn, also in Aries right now, will stand almost exactly opposite America's natal Saturn in Libra while squaring the Cancer sun. Saturn is at roughly 1415 Aries, with its the natal Saturn being at 1449 Libra. And this can signify global reassessment, restructuring, and testing of societal foundations, often bringing hardships, delays, and a reckoning with past collective decisions. The country will face a confrontation between identity, authority, and the institutions that claim to preserve order. Neptune and Aries will square America's natal Venus and Jupiter in Cancer. The mythology of heroic action will press against the country's inherited values, wealth, and definition of belonging. Pluto and Aquarius will be close to the American South Node in the third house. The propaganda, the divisions, the script, all old and being re examined. The stories United States has repeated so often that they begin moving automatically. And none of this guarantees another civil war. There's so much other stuff going on, different aspects, different energies, just at different times. We're more spread out in some ways. As astrology does not eliminate choice by converting history into destiny, but it does tell us which parts of the national chart are being activated, and there are certainly patterns to watch for. The same houses are speaking, and what happens when a nation celebrating its freedom is forced to confront the people whose captivity made that freedom possible. So let's start with Neptune. Neptune is often described as illusion, deception, confusion, and those meanings are accurate. It'd be incomplete to stop there. Neptune also governs collective imagination, faith, sacrifices, and martyrdom. The stories through which people find meaning, the dream of unity, the fantasy that differences can be dissolved into something larger, and the mythology a nation creates about itself. Pisces is the ocean. It dissolves distinction and carries what appeared to be separate into one shared body. During the 1850s, the United States imagined itself as a republic founded upon liberty while maintaining an economic and political system built upon the ownership of human beings. That contradiction had existed from the nation's beginning. What Neptune and Pisces did was dissolve the containers, the structures that had allowed the contradiction to remain politically manageable. The nation had tried to separate freedom from slavery geographically. Free states here, slave states there. Slavery below one line, freedom above it. But freedom for all, which is quick anecdote why Oklahoma has that tiny, tiny sliver of a panhandle above Texas. Texas had to give up that land if they wanted to qualify geographically as a pro-slave state. But as Neptune moved through Pisces, the waves of the ocean started exposing the unsustainable facades. Neptune in Aries also creates heroic leadership images. The leader becomes an avatar of collective will. Their injuries become the nation's injuries. Their survival becomes evidence of destiny. Their political struggle becomes a sacred battle between order and chaos, good and evil, restoration and destruction. And this can occur across ideological lines. Liberation movements can use heroic imagery to challenge systems that once appeared permanent. People may become willing to act where previous generations remained passive, but heroic mythology can also dissolve accountability. When a leader becomes synonymous with the nation, criticism of that leader can be treated as hatred of the country. When political loyalty becomes spiritual identity, compromises begin to feel like um, all that more difficult. Sacrilege, some would say. Neptune does not simply make people believe something untrue, it makes belief feel holy. Aries then gives holiness a weapon. Now, while Neptune governed the national dream, so to speak, Uranus governed the ground beneath it. Uranus moved through Taurus during the 1850s. It has recently completed another passage through the same sign. Taurus concerns the material conditions required to live: land, food, shelter, money, labor, resources, the physical body, ownership, security. Uranus disrupts whatever it touches. It exposes structures that appeared stable. It releases forces trapped beneath the surface. In the 1850s, the United States material crisis centered upon slavery. Who owned the land? Who performed the labor? Could a human body be treated as property? Could that property be carried into federal territory? Could an enslaved person alter their status by crossing into free soil? And could Congress restrict the expansion of slave property? These were Taurian questions. They concerned the ownership and movement of bodies through land. Uranus entered the final decan of Taurus during the escalation of Bleeding Kansas. It approached the fixed star Algol during the May 1856 crisis. Algol is located in the head of Medusa in the constellation Perseus. Its traditional symbolism includes the head and face, terror, rage, violence, dehumanization, sudden endings, sudden death, beheadings, a danger of becoming consumed by collective fear. But Medusa offers a more useful interpretation than simply calling Algol violent or evil. Medusa is the figure of a woman who was raped that was turned into a monster within someone else's version of that story. Her head is severed, her body becomes an object, her image is used as a weapon. Algol can reveal what happens when a society refuses to look directly at the violence supporting its own order. The person who forces the culture to look, who forces people to look, they become the monster. The witness becomes the threat. The head that names the horror becomes the head that must be severed. So when the Fugitive Slave Act became law in September 1850, Neptune was near 5 degrees Pisces, forming a square with the natal Uranus and a trine with Venus and Jupiter in Cancer. The law made the division between free and slave territory porous. An enslaved person could physically cross into a free state. But slavery's legality in slave states could follow them. The border did not guarantee freedom. Federal officials could enter northern communities and seize people accused of escaping slavery. Northern residents would be required to participate. Free Black Americans could also be captured and forced into proceedings in which their own testimony was excluded. The national fantasy had been that free and slave states could coexist within one federal system while remaining morally separate. The Fugitive Slave Act revealed the price of that arrangement. The free states had to participate in the preservation of slavery. The law did not allow northern communities to remain innocent observers. It dissolved the psychological boundary between the section practicing slavery and the section claiming distance from it. Neptune in Pisces asks, what happens when someone else's suffering is no longer safely contained somewhere beyond the distant shore? What happens when the ocean carries it to your own shore? And when the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed the Senate on March 4th, 1854, now Neptune was near 13 degrees Pisces. The sun was also near 13 degrees. Pisces, forming a cazimi that also made a trine with the natal sun in Cancer and a square with a natal ascendant in Sagittarius. Expansion formed on lies and creating a nationwide identity crisis. The legislation was presented through a democratic ideal, popular sovereignty, as we talked about. Let the settlers decide whether slavery would be permitted. Allow the people living in the territory to determine their own institutions. The ideal seemed clear as the sun is bright. The reality was anything but. Who counted as a settler? Who counted as a voter? How long did someone have to live in what was called Kansas before claiming political authority there? What prevented people from crossing the Missouri border solely to control an election? Could the language of democracy produce a legitimate outcome when the choice being offered was whether one group of people could legally own another? So, Sun Neptune can eliminate an ideal, but it can also obscure the failings behind the illusion of choice. The Kansas Nebraska Act dissolved the Missouri Compromise boundary and replaced it with a promise, an insincere one. The promise was that the democratic process would somehow settle the question. But the process had no protection from the forces attempting to capture it. Popular sovereignty became a mirage floating above armed migration, electoral fraud, and territorial conquest. The law did not remove slavery from national politics. It released slavery from an old boundary and allowed the conflict to spread. So then, Bleeding Kansas, right? All of the militia activity, John Brown abolitionists, pro slavers, the anti-slavery. Um, Bleeding Kansas may be one of the clearest political manifestations of Neptune and Pisces, and certainly a precursor to the House divided and Uranus and Gemini. Kansas contained one territory but two governments. One operated through the federally recognized pro-slavery legislature at Lecompton. The other emerged from the Free State movement at Topeka. Each claimed legitimacy. Each regarded the other as unlawful. One side described the March 1855 election as the valid expression of territorial government, while the other saw an invasion carried out through fraudulent ballots. One side called its armed forces a lawful posse, the other called them border ruffians. They were slave patrols, militias. One side had rebellion, the other self-defense. Kansas did not merely contain conflicting opinions, it contained incompatible political realities. The factions could not agree about which government was real, which election was valid, or which acts constituted lawful authority. This is a profoundly Neptunian crisis. A society can survive disagreement while the participants still recognize the same institutions, the same procedures, and some common method for determining what happened. The danger deepens when those shared mechanisms disappear. When each faction possesses its own government, its own press, and its own version of reality, compromise begins to look less like cooperation and more like surrender to something illegitimate. Kansas became a small scale model of the national fracture to come. One geographic body, two identities, neither willing to recognize the sovereignty of the other. A similar energy, I would argue, occurred on January 6th in the US, another time period with Neptune in Pisces and Uranus in Taurus. By the time we get to Charles Sumner delivering the Crime Against Kansas speech on May 19, 1856, Neptune was near 20 degrees Pisces. Mercury was near 20 degrees Gemini. They formed an exceptionally close square, while transiting Neptune also opposed the natal Neptune at 22 degrees Virgo. Mercury collects information. It names people, events, and systems. It draws distinctions. It discerns. It refines. It organizes facts into an argument. Neptune searches for the invisible story connecting those facts. It turns a series of events into a moral narrative. Sumner was not merely describing several acts of violence. He was arguing that the fraud, intimidation, and bloodshed in Kansas were expressions of one larger structure. He wanted the country to see that Kansas, Nebraska, the bogus legislator, the armed invasions, and the destruction of free state institutions were not unrelated accidents. They belonged to the power protecting slavery. This is the revelatory potential of Mercury Neptune. Language makes the invisible architecture visible, but the aspect also carries a warning. Neptune magnifies metaphor, protection, symbolic excess. Sumner did not confine himself to a legal argument, nor should he have. He turned pro slavery politicians into characters inside a grotesque national drama. He humiliated Andrew Butler through sexualized language. He attacked the mythology of Southern honor as well as the policy of slavery. The speech became an indictment not only of legislation, but of identity. Preston Brooks did not experience it as an ordinary disagreement requiring rebuttal. He experienced it as a violation demanding punishment. 3 days later, the speech was answered via a cane taken to Sumner's body. So that's on May 22nd, 1856. Brooks attacked Sumner at his Senate desk as he was trapped, as Brooks's associates kept other people held back from helping Sumner. At the approximate time of the assault, Mercury was close to the midheaven of that event chart. The violence was inseparable from speech. Brooks was not attacking Sumner over an immediate physical threat. He was attacking him over words spoken days before. The beating was intended as a response, a message. But the message did not remain under Brooks's control, under the pro-slavery coalition's control. Sumner's bloodied body became another form of political communication. Northern newspapers and lithographs transformed the assault into evidence that the defenders of slavery could not answer speech with speech. Southern admirers transformed Brooks into a defender of honor. Replacement canes were sent to him. The country looked at the same attack and saw two different stories. The event itself became Neptunian. The physical act disappeared beneath the competing symbols assigned to it. Sumner became martyr, Brooks became a champion. The Senate chamber became an image of the nation. The institution built for debate had become a place where argument was answered with weapon. The Senate's own historical account describes the chamber becoming a combat zone on May 22nd, 1856. Neptune does not only hide facts, it can absorb facts into mythology until people no longer respond to the event itself. They respond to what the event has come to represent. And when Sumner began the crime against Kansas, Uranus was moving through Lake Taurus toward Algol. The sack of Lawrence followed. Then the caning, then the Potawatomi killings. The symbolism moves repeatedly through Taurus and Algol. Printing presses are destroyed as Senator names the violence beneath the political system. His head is beaten because he named it. John Brown responds to pro-slavery violence by selecting bodies associated with the opposing faction and killing them. The conflict over ownership has entered the body. The country is not merely debating an economic system, it is reenacting that system's logic. People become objects, bodies become messages. The victim is selected not only for what they personally did, but for what they have been made to represent. The conflict over ownership entered the body of the country. With the Dred Scott decision on March 6, 1857, it came while Uranus remained in late Taurus and within the a broader algal sphere. The case brought together nearly every Taurus theme: land, ownership, the body, property. Dred Scott had lived in places where slavery was prohibited. The court ruled that his movement through free territory had not made him free. It also declared that Black Americans descended from enslaved Africans were not citizens within the meaning of the Constitution and that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the federal territories. The material claim of ownership was placed above the political claim of belonging. The state attempted to preserve the property system by excluding an entire class of people from the national body. The decision was intended to resolve the question. Uranus made the resolution explosive. Instead of ending the conflict, the ruling persuaded more Northerners that the federal government's institutions were being used to nationalize slavery. The court tried to close the door. Uranus tore the wall around it apart. Uranus first enters Gemini on June 2nd, 1858. 2 weeks later, Abraham Lincoln delivered the House Divided speech. Uranus returned briefly to Taurus at the beginning of 1859, then entered Gemini permanently on March 14th. After that final ingress came Harper's Ferry, John Brown's trial and execution, the 1860 presidential election, the fracture of the Democratic Party, secession ordinances, the organization of the Confederacy, and Fort Sumter. Uranus and Taurus had destabilized the material system. Uranus and Gemini destabilized the language and political architecture built around it. Gemini governs communication, news, debate, education, transportation, trade, the movement of information from one person to another. Uranus electrifies, accelerates, and fractures. Under Uranus and Gemini, the country's sectional argument became a communications war. Speeches were printed and distributed. Newspapers created regional realities. Political parties divided. We saw the ending of the Whig and the forming of the Republican Party. Court rulings were interrupted through incompatible constitutional theories. The country developed two definitions of liberty and two claims to the American inheritance. Eventually, those definitions acquired separate governments. Gemini's doubling became literal, the United States of America and the Confederate States of America. By the time Brown was executed on December 2nd, 1859, Neptune had reached approximately 24 degrees Pisces, moving away from a direct opposition to her natal Virgo Neptune at 22. Brown had become more than the person who led the Potawatomi killings and raided Harper's Ferry. He had become a vessel for incompatible national projections. To many white Southerners, Brown represented the nightmare of armed slave rebellion supported by Northern abolitionists. To many abolitionists, he represented the failure of peaceful institutions and the moral necessity of resistance. He became terrorist, murderer, liberator, fanatic, prophet, martyr. To me, I'm sure to a great many, he is a hero and a better man than Lincoln himself is made out to be. His actions were partly a catalyst that made Lincoln's presidency possible. This is one of Neptune's most powerful operations. The individual body is transformed into a screen upon which the collective projects its fears, hopes, and religious meanings. Brown's execution did not settle the argument over what he had done. It released him into national mythology. The government could hang the person. It could not hang the symbol. And by time we get to the winter of secession, Neptune had entered the final degrees of Pisces. Abraham Lincoln was elected in November 1860. South Carolina seceded in December. The Confederate States of America was organized in February 1861. Lincoln was inaugurated that March. Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter on April 12th. Major Robert Anderson surrendered the fort at 2:30 in the afternoon on April 13th, and later that same day, Neptune made its final ingress into Aries. Fort Sumter surrendered as Neptune reached the end of Pisces and crossed into Aries. The old national identity had dissolved. Two governments now existed. Two governments at war. Two presidents claimed authority. Two nations claimed the heritage of the American Revolution. Which version of the United States is willing to fight for its existence? Aries gives Neptune a body capable of action, where Pisces is the ocean. Pisces is the liminal, right? It's a dreamy. It's not as tangible and action oriented like Aries. The dream becomes a mission. The symbol becomes a banner. Sacrifice becomes enlistment, the prophet a commander. Neptune in Pisces asks what we believe. Neptune in Aries asks what are we prepared to do because we believe it. During the Civil War, both Union and Confederacy constructed heroic stories about themselves. The Confederacy framed its rebellion through sovereignty, independence, defense of homeland, and resistance to the invasion, while preserving a social order based upon slavery. The Union initially framed the war primarily through preservation of constitutional government and restoration of federal authority. Initially, both sides described themselves as defenders. Few people imagined themselves as the aggressor in their own story, in their own national mythology in this case. That is one of Neptune and Aries' central dangers. Violence becomes easier to justify when it has been renamed holy, essentially, necessary. Aggression becomes sacred when the enemy is imagined as an existential threat. Neptune briefly returned to Pisces on October 1st of 1861 and then entered Aries permanently on February 14th, 1862. As the transit settled into Aries, the purpose of the war began changing. The conflict could not remain merely an attempt to restore the nation as it had existed before secession. The war was being forced toward the issue buried beneath every compromise it had failed: slavery. The old Union could not simply be constructed unchanged. A new national identity would have to be forged through the conflict. And that is when Lincoln changed to this abolitionist that we remember him as. Um, I think also, just quick side note, it's important to note that um, though Abraham Lincoln did become a figure in eradicating slavery, in a sense, in the United States, um, he and a lot of Americans, even abolitionists, maybe not most abolitionists, but Northerners even still held that the indigenous people, the Native Americans, were savages. That part of the nation story, never really went away. Um, and so it becomes this very disingenuous fight for liberty still, essentially. Um, so recently, talking is hard. I need some water. Mhm. Neptune first entered Pisces again on April 4th, 2011, briefly returning to Aquarius as it does with retrogrades. It entered Pisces for the longer passage on February 3rd, 2012. Remained there until its sneak peek at its Aries ingress on March 30th, 2025. It returned to Pisces on October 22nd, 25, and then entered Aries permanently on January 26th of earlier this year, 2026, and is there currently. And once again, Neptune and Pisces dissolved boundaries, but the ocean was now digital. News, entertainment, propaganda, personal confession, political organizing, and conspiracy flowed through the same devices. A person could experience a protest, a war, a pandemic, a police killing, a genocide, or an election dispute from a screen held inches from their face. We became connected to more human suffering than any previous society could have witnessed in real time. We also became vulnerable to more manipulation, distortion, and invented reality. The Neptune and Pisces internet could expose what institutions had hidden. It could allow witnesses to speak directly. It could connect people previously kept apart. And it could also remove context, reward emotional intensity, and carry falsehood faster than verification. And by 2025, Pew found enormous partisan divisions in which news sources Americans used and trusted. Other surveys found that 9 in 10 Americans had at least sometimes encountered news they believed was inaccurate, while 42% said this happened often or extremely often. The national crisis was no longer only that Americans disagreed about what policies should be adopted. Increasingly, they disagreed about which events had actually occurred, or interpretations of the events, at the very least, which institutions were legitimate and which sources were capable of establishing truth. The ocean connected everyone, but we didn't have a map to navigate the ocean. And with the 2020 election and January 6, 2021, we saw the exposure of the depth of this fracture. False claims that the election had been stolen circulated through legacy media, social platforms, political organizations, private networks, lawyers. And on January 6th, a mob incited by the sitting president entered the United States Capitol while Congress was meeting to certify the Electoral College vote. And you would think if John Brown was tried, convicted, and executed for treason against this country, that certainly that this would constitute treason. Apparently not this time. The official House investigation later concluded that many participants had been provoked by false information about the election that were repeatedly reinforced through political and media systems. This was not Bleeding Kansas. Those histories are not interchangeable, but the pattern is recognizable. Once again, a significant political faction rejected the legitimacy of an electoral process. Once again, the Capitol became the physical site where incompatible claims to lawful authority collided. And once again, violence entered an institution designed to translate political conflict into procedure. In 1856, the body of Charles Sumner was beaten inside the Senate because his words had violated the honor system of slavery's defenders. In 2021, the Capitol itself was breached amid claims that the constitutional transfer of power was illegitimate. The 19th century had competing governments in one territory. The 21st century had competing stories about whether the elected government was real. Also, with Neptune and Pisces, we had the COVID-19 pandemic. And then this wasn't the only transit at that time that contributed to this. We also had that Saturn Pluto conjunction. But for the sake of not going too far down too many rabbit holes, I'm looking at comparison the 1850s to now. And this was another signature event during that Neptune and Pisces time. Also, while Uranus was in Taurus. The COVID-19 pandemic gave the transit an even more literal form. A virus ignored borders. Breath, like water, connected strangers. An individual body could become a carrier inside a collective system. Private behavior became a public health question, and the pandemic confronted the country with a Piscean reality. No one exists entirely alone. One person's actions move through other bodies, but the same interdependence could be experienced as invasion. A mask could symbolize care or fear, expertise, obedience, coercion, political identity. The object did not change. Its meaning changed according to the mythology surrounding it based on political identity and other factors. Neptune and Pisces revealed collective vulnerability. It also revealed how difficult collective action becomes when a society lacks a shared definition of the reality. Neptune first entered Aries on March 30th, 2025. It returned briefly to Pisces that October and entered Aries permanently on January 26th, 2026. We are now at the beginning stages of that transit. We cannot expect an exact reenactment of 1861 again. Yet we should expect the style of collective mythology to change. We should expect to see patterns similar to then come back up. Pisces diffuses. Aries concentrates. It initiates. Pisces says we are all part of the same ocean, right? And it's the culmination. It's the ending of the zodiacal order. And then we go back to Aries, and Aries says, this is who I am. This is what I defend. This is the line I will not allow you to cross. And under Neptune and Aries, identity can become more active, embodied, and militant. The nation is no longer only a story people tell, it becomes a cause people perform. People defend. The language of politics becomes filled with warriors, invasions, occupations, traitors, liberators, and enemies. We have holy wars, right? We have that language. We have an administration that fights with the Pope. The politician becomes a savior or a tyrant. The protester becomes both a hero or a terrorist. The citizen becomes both a patriot or a collaborator. Complex human beings are cast into roles, archetypes, inside this mythological liminal battle. And one place where this symbolism has already been visible is the language around surrounding borders. Surrounding the southern border. In January of 2025, the White House declared a national emergency at the border and described American sovereignty as being under attack. A related proclamation explicitly used the language of invasion. We know why this was. The inaugural address promised to send troops to the border to repel the invasion. The language used matters independently of any position on immigration policy. A government can debate immigration through law, labor, asylum procedure, demographics, economics, or humanitarian responsibility. And any number of those can be right, misaligned, or wrong. But the language of invasion places the issue inside a war story. This is a war now. The border becomes a front. Migrants are an advancing force. Enforcement becomes defense of the homeland. And national identity is constructed through the presence of someone imagined as entering from outside. This is Neptune and Aries. The myth of the nation needs an enemy at the gate. It needs a scapegoat. The danger is not simply harsh policy. The depth of this is that individual human beings disappear beneath the role assigned to them inside the mythology. And in some cases, the human being literally disappears. The migrant is an invader now. The protester, is an insurrectionist. The journalist is an enemy. Opponents are traitors. Once the symbolic category replaces the person, almost any treatment of the person can be justified as defense against the category. And with Uranus, it first entered Taurus in 2018 and began its final movement through the third decan in 2023. It entered that decan permanently in March 2024. Our material crisis is not identical to the crisis of the 1850s. Chattel slavery is not interchangeable with housing costs, automation, border policy, or the modern labor market. Arguably, though, there are still existing forms of slavery, like the prison system. For example, prisoners are legally allowed to be slaves, essentially, by the nature of the Constitution and the amendments in the Bill of Rights. But Uranus has once again destabilized the material agreement beneath the country. Who can afford shelter? Who owns the homes in which other people live? And what happens when wages and productivity separate to the point that being productive doesn't earn you a wage you can live off of? What happens when artificial intelligence threatens to transform intellectual and creative labor and steal personhood from people, steal voice from people? And who controls that technology? Should they control that technology? Who owns the data? Should they own the data? Should anyone own something like data? And ultimately, who profits from the replacement of workers, right? What legal power does a person possess over their own body? And that varies from, like, if you're queer, if you're a woman with a uterus, if you're a black or brown American, if you're indigenous, your bodily autonomy changes from person to person. It's not universal. So it's hypocritical. I mean, because it should be universal. And what happens when citizenship, healthcare, food, employment, and physical survival are increasingly mediated by systems people experience as remote or inhuman? So Uranus in Taurus reveals that economic instability is never purely economic. Material insecurity changes political identity. When people believe the system does not recognize their humanity, they become more willing to tear the system apart. The question is whether that rupture creates liberation or merely gives new owners control of the wreckage. On July 13th, 2024, a gunman attempted to assassinate Donald Trump at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. One spectator was killed. Trump and other spectators were injured. The FBI investigated the shooting as an assassination attempt and potential act of domestic terrorism. At the time, Uranus was near 26 degrees Taurus, close to Algol. Mars was also in late Taurus and moving toward an exact conjunction. The exact Mars-Uranus conjunction occurred on July 15th at approximately 26 degrees 19 minutes Taurus, with a close orb of Algol's modern position. Arguably, July 13th, it was close enough that this was a Mars-Uranus conjunction with Algol. Political violence, the head and face, blood becoming an image, the body of a national leader transformed almost instantly into political mythology. The photograph of Trump raising his fist with blood across his face circulated across the world. The body became propaganda before the event had been fully investigated. MAGA interpreted the image through survival, courage, providence, and destiny. Their savior, right? Others interpret it through fear of escalating political violence and the possibility that the image would strengthen authoritarian mythology. And in true Neptunian fashion, the photo was staged. Realistically, the whole thing was. Secret Service would not allow the president to pose in the open for a photo while he was under threat. We all know that. There is video from people that were there, cell phones, that you could see them setting up the photo. You don't set up a photo like that when the president has just been, shot, in my opinion. And once again, the person began disappearing beneath the symbol. I mean, that's been his whole thing. Trump has become a symbol to certain people, a figurehead, right? A cult of personality. Sumner's injured head became an argument about slavery and northern freedom. Trump's bloodied face became an argument about America, victimhood, power, and historical destiny. Technology changed, the symbolic mechanism had not. And then in February of 2026, Uranus, not alongside Mars this time, Uranus was conjunct Algol, and we bombed Iran, severed their leadership when the Khomeini was killed. Uranus' first transit into Gemini was July 7th, 2025. It returned to Taurus on November 8th and entered Gemini on April 26th, 2026. This time, Gemini's information systems operate at a speed the 19th century could not have imagined. Artificial intelligence, deepfakes, synthetic voices, live streamed atrocities, podcasts, encrypted networks, algorithms suppressing our First Amendment rights, cyber attacks, real time surveillance. Abolitionists in the 1850s depended upon speeches, newspapers, pamphlets, lithographs. A message might require days or weeks to reach a national audience back then. Today, a sentence can reach millions of people before the speaker finishes the paragraph. The speed offers extraordinary possibilities. Witnesses can document abuses. Movements can organize without waiting for traditional institutions. Information once monopolized by governments or corporations can be distributed immediately. But speed also shortens the distance between rumor and reaction. A fabricated image can produce real anger. A false report can move real bodies. A clipped video can create a political identity detached from the event it supposedly records. Gemini moves the message, Uranus removes the brakes. During the 1850s, northern and southern newspapers constructed increasingly incompatible versions of the truth. Today, those fragmentations are even more intimate. Two people can live on the same street and receive entirely different stories through their screens. One person's reliable source is another person's propagandist. One person's whistleblower is another person's criminal. A protest is someone else's invasion. This is more dangerous than ordinary misinformation. A lie can be corrected when people still share a method for determining truth, discernment, right? The deeper crisis arrives when no institution possesses authority outside the audience that already trusts it. Uranus in Gemini does not merely increase the amount of information, it destabilizes the channels through which information becomes public knowledge. The old gatekeepers lose control, which can be liberating, and it can also leave the public inside an endless electrical storm, unable to distinguish revelation from manipulation. And I would say that there is a modern house divided that is getting stronger as Uranus moved into Gemini, just as it, got stronger, um, preceding Lincoln's House divided speech. The United States is not currently divided along, some clean geographic line that shaped the Civil War back then. The divisions run through states, cities, churches, workplaces, families, sometimes through the interior life of one person. But the national identities competing for legitimacy are increasingly difficult to reconcile. Is the United States a multiracial civic democracy whose founding promises must be expanded? Or is it the inheritance of a particular religious and cultural people who must reclaim it? Is citizenship primarily a legal status, a birthright, a racial or ancestral inheritance? Is the federal government the protector of civil rights? or the enemy of local sovereignty. We aren't facing simple policy differences. These are rival definitions of the national body. And that is the echo of the 1850s. That is the pattern reemerging. The danger is not that disagreement exists. The danger is that each faction may come to believe the other has no legitimate right to govern or exist. So with that, this we're on July 3rd now. If you're listening to it on the day it came out, might be past July 4th, but July 4th, 2026, Mars will conjoin Uranus at roughly 3 degrees and 52 minutes in Gemini. This date is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The official America 250 commemoration describes July 4th, 2026 as the nation organizing major celebrations across the country. Whoopee. The symbolism is concentrated almost to the point of being performative, right? This is a sad, tired, old white racist man putting on an Uncle Sam costume and throwing fireworks up in the air and saying celebrate. And people just go woo, don't even know what they're celebrating. So Mars and Uranus mean the sign of declaration on the anniversary of the declaration. Also the sign, their return to the sign they were when it was signed. As again, like I said, though, they were not, there was not a conjunction at the signing of the Declaration of Independence that had preceded that. The United States will be performing one of its largest rituals of national identity while the planets of action and disruption conjoin in the sign of speech, media, messages, and competing narratives. It's not a promise, guarantee, prophecy that a disaster will occur, but a conjunction describes pressure. It describes the type of energy demanding expression. And how that energy manifests depends upon human choices, institutions, preparation, and circumstance. Mars acts. It cuts, moves, fights, severs. It pursues and defends. Uranus disrupts. It shocks, liberates, rebels. It accelerates and breaks patterns that appeared permanent, sustainable. When Mars meets Uranus, action becomes sudden. The gap between impulse and consequence narrows. And that combination can bring breakthroughs, courageous rebellion, and decisive movement. It can also bring volatility, accidents, rash action, and attempt to force liberation without considering what will exist after the rupture. In Gemini, the field of action is communication. A message can become an event. An announcement can change the political atmosphere before anyone has time to prepare for that change, right? It's sudden. It feels disruptive. A leak can destabilize an entire institution. A rumor can direct a crowd to look the wrong way. A technological failure can interrupt travel, commerce, or communication. Mars, Uranus, and Gemini reminds us that information is not weightless. It still moves bodies. It moves through bodies. And so this conjunction does not occur in isolation. When Mars and Uranus meet near 4 degrees Gemini, Neptune will be near 4 degrees Aries, Pluto 5 degrees Aquarius. Mars and Uranus will sextile Neptune and trine Pluto. This creates a tightly connected outer planet circuit. Neptune in Aries supplies the ideological vision, the sacred cause. Again, that national mythology, the belief that action serves a larger destiny, and anyone in the way of that destiny be damned. Pluto in Aquarius supplies collective power, mass movements, networks, surveillance, technology. a struggle over who controls the societal body, the collective as a whole. And Uranus in Gemini supplies the shock moving through the communication system. And that shock is sometimes needed. That shock isn't violence. That shock, even in an interpersonal level, um, could be something that might motivate you to start like a creative project or something, right? Like, sometimes disruption is absolutely needed because we as individuals get caught in just, patterns that aren't serving us anymore. And that expands to the collective as well. So it's a shock that can move through the communication system. And Mars activates that structure. It gives fire and impulse to it. It turns the pattern from atmosphere into event. And I mean, that could trigger technological breakthroughs. It could be protest movements. It could be a major disclosure on something, a political announcement. You could see transportation crises, communication failures. But something wants to move. The fuse is digital, social, and rhetorical. We also have Mercury in retrograde in Cancer during the conjunction to contend with. It will be passing over its same spot where it was at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, meaning that Mercury retrograde in Cancer right now will be opposing the United States natal Pluto in Capricorn. So Cancer governs the homeland, nostalgia, protection, the stories people tell about where they came from and who belongs inside the home, so to speak. So the United States will be celebrating its 250th birthday while Mercury retrograde wants it to revisit that memory. It wants it to get nostalgic. It wants it who was included when the Declaration proclaimed equality. Why were people excluded? Whose labor made the republic possible and why did they not count? Whose land was taken to expand it and why have we not done anything to fix that? Which promises were fulfilled? Which remain unfulfilled? What does independence mean when the document declaring it was written inside a society practicing slavery? Mercury retrograde does not require forgetting history. It can expose the parts of history that the official story edited out. Cancer wants an origin story. Retrograde Mercury returns to the root cellar and opens the boxes the family has avoided. When Uranus entered Gemini in 1858, that's when Lincoln declared that a house divided against itself could not stand. And he did not mean disagreement was intolerable. He meant the country could not permanently sustain two um, incompatible systems while pretending the contradiction would resolve itself. The conflict had moved beyond isolated legislation. The modern contradiction is not identical, but we should ask the same structural question. What conflict are we repeatedly attempting to manage without confronting its foundation? Can a country remain democratic when a large faction believes elections are legitimate only when they win? Can citizenship remain a shared national status when belonging is treated as conditional? These are questions beneath these transits. The lessons of the 1850s is not that civil war suddenly erupted because people became angry. The violence was prepared through language. People were taught who the enemy was. They were taught which institutions were fraudulent. They were taught which election results did not deserve recognition, that compromise meant submission, that their opponents were not merely mistaken, but criminal. monstrous, tyrannical. Then that rhetoric entered bodies. Printing presses were destroyed, Sumner was beaten, men were dragged from their homes at Potawatomi, prisoners were killed, and eventually cannons fired upon Fort Sumter. Language was not separate from the violence. And this is why Mars, Uranus, and Gemini deserves attention, not because a particular event is fated, as I've said, but because the distance between message and action is usually short. But Uranus also liberates. Mars can supply courage, and Gemini can connect those two, right? And maybe that sudden change is that. Not collectively, or certainly not within this government. But I mean, looking at the positive with the individuals or communities, right? The same conjunction that can accelerate propaganda can also accelerate truth. It can spread panic, but it can also organize mutual aid. And the same technologies that are used to fabricate evidence can also expose abuses once hidden behind institutional facades. Neptune in Aries wants a cause. It wants something worthy of sacrifice. That desire is not inherently dangerous. Every movement for liberation requires people willing to act for a reality that does not yet exist. Every movement of liberation requires a John Brown. The danger is allowing the cause to erase the humanity of everyone outside of it, believing purity matters more than truth, confusing certainty with courage, and creating unity by inventing an enemy whose suffering no longer matters. The previous Neptune and Aries cycle from the 1850s reminds us that a nation can be reborn through struggle. It also reminds us that rebirth can require an enormous human cost when the underlying contradiction is allowed to fester until violence appears to be the only remaining language. If you keep putting people in cages, if you keep coming at people with guns, those people want out of those cages. The myths are acquiring bodies, and the stories are moving toward action. When Neptune and Pisces dissolved the fantasy that freedom and slavery could remain separate realities inside one nation, Uranus in Taurus at the same time exposed the land, labor, and bodies beneath that fantasy. And as it approached Algol in the third decan of Taurus, it revealed the violence required to maintain that system. John Brown's violence became necessary because of the violence of the system that we are forced to be plugged into. Then Uranus entered Gemini, and we saw the material fracture become a fracture of language, political parties, newspapers, constitutions, and national identity. And eventually, with the Neptune and Aries and the surrender of Fort Sumter, two competing stories of America had taken up arms. Today, Neptune has completed another passage through Pisces. The shared reality has again become porous. The nation is again arguing over who belongs, what citizenship means, which institutions are legitimate, and whether political opponents inhabit the same moral universe. Uranus has again crossed the late Taurus and Algol. The material body of the country is unstable. Land, labor, housing, technology, bodily autonomy, and survival have become revolutionary questions. The national nervous system is electrified with Uranus in Gemini. The most persistent American myth is that corruption is something that happened to this country later, that there was a fall from grace, that there was once a clean version of the United States. But with a country with natal Neptune in Virgo, there is an illusion and disillusionment around discernment and refinement. A republic born in liberty, guided by noble ideals, gradually damaged by greed, racism, extremism, or the arrival of a single malicious political leader. According to that story, the country began healthy. The disease, the rot came afterward. But the United States was not born innocent and later corrupted. The corruption was present in the foundation. It was established through the seizure of land already inhabited and governed by sovereign indigenous nations. It was built through campaigns of displacement, broken treaties, forced removal, and genocide. Its economy was fed by human trafficking, by the kidnapping, sale, forced migration, and inherited enslavement of African people and their descendants. And a lot of white people, especially middle class, upper class, have been protected by, classism and white supremacy. The idea that we are special because of the way we look and what jobs we have. But if in order to spin the tale that is a great nation, we have to ignore the genocide of the natives, ignore slavery was ingrained in our liberties, it becomes a toxic nostalgia that is not so different than a toxic attachment with an abusive partner. Oh, I know they beat these people and they say these racist things, but they mean well. And now with Neptune and Aries, that disillusionment is fading. White people are being executed in broad daylight by modern-day slave catchers. They are being sentenced to 50-plus years in prison as terrorists for standing up against ICE and the far-right immigration policies. And these are not unfortunate side effects of the American project. They're not invented by the Trump administration. They were among the systems that made the project materially possible. Independence did not end the colonial occupation of indigenous land. It transferred control of that occupation from the British Crown to a new settler government. The revolution just changed the flag. It did not dismantle the system. Not even the Civil War dismantled it. It led to Black Americans having to fight themselves for civil rights. Black Americans did not have the same rights as Americans until the 1950s, and I would argue that that's still a very fragile armistice at best, as we have seen recently with the gutting of voter rights and other protections against Black communities, neighborhoods, and our brown and immigrant communities and indigenous communities here in this country. The Declaration of Independence announced that all men were created equal, while roughly 1/5 of the people living in the 13 colonies were enslaved. That's not all men. Thomas Jefferson wrote about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness while enslaving hundreds of people over the course of his life, abusing them, raping them. Their labor created the wealth, leisure, and social position that allowed him to write, study, and govern. The liberty of the man writing the sentence depended upon the captivity of the people surrounding him. That is not liberty. And when the Declaration described indigenous resistance to colonial expansion, it did not recognize native nations defending their land. America declared itself the victim of tyranny while claiming the right to expand across someone else's home. Imagine your neighbor arms themselves, kicks down your front door, and claims your living room in the name of liberty and freedom. That's what the United States is. It's a hypocritical bully. It declared liberty while preserving slavery. It demanded freedom from an empire while building an empire of slavery of its own. It knew it had to destroy native cultures, just as colonialists in Europe knew they had to destroy pagan, Druidic, etc. cultures because they existed outside of the empire. They existed outside of male dominance. They were living proof that freedom actually existed, and the machine cannot allow proof of its failure to exist. It has to be perfect. It cannot be criticized. And this is important because whenever the United States moves into this more visible authoritarianism, people begin comparing the country to Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. And I understand the comparison. Nazi Germany gives us a familiar vocabulary for propaganda, racial nationalism, mass detention, political scapegoating, citizenship based upon blood, and the transformation of state violence into bureaucratic procedures. And it preserves the facade of the perfect country. Well, it's not that bad. At least we aren't Germany. Most of us remember the American Revolution as a fight against tyranny and taxation. That's a lie. Taxation without representation was one of the grievances against King George. However, the chief grievance was as follows. He has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose no rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Colonialists wanted to take more indigenous land, and King George said no. And this made them absolutely furious to the point that a backcountry militia took up arms and attacked British troops. The first shots of the so-called revolution were over native land. The ideals of liberty and freedom were that of the freedom to commit genocide. It's right there in the text we refer to almost daily. Overlooked out of white privilege with the same apathy Northerners had towards slavery. The United States does not need to become Germany in order to become authoritarian. America only needs to become more fully committed to parts of its own history, which it is. We do not need to cross the Atlantic to find governments defining citizenship by race. We have Dred Scott. We do not need another continent for forced population removal. We have the Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, and hundreds of broken treaties. We do not need for an example of families separated by state policy. Enslaved families were divided through sale. Indigenous children were later removed from their homes and placed in boarding schools designed to destroy their language and culture. Humans were trafficked. Children went for a price that was equal to the cost of a house at the time. I don't have to go into detail as to why. The Epstein class has always existed here. They were just called something else. We do not need to borrow a model of racial surveillance. We have slave patrols, now called ICE and Homeland Security. We do not need to import laws controlling interracial marriage. American states had already constructed those. We do not need to imagine what it looks like when a government decides one population may be detained, transported, or dispossessed for the supposed safety of another. That material is inherent in the birth of the United States, in the signing of the Declaration of Independence. In fact, Nazi legal thinkers studied American racial law while developing their own system. They examined American citizenship restrictions, immigration law, and the architecture of Jim Crow. So when we compare the United States to Nazi Germany without looking backward into American history, we can accidentally reverse the direction of influence. We imagine America, the United States, approaching something alien when some of the people constructing that system had already looked toward America for precedent. This does not make the Holocaust interchangeable with American slavery or indigenous genocide. Historical comparison requires specificity. These systems operated differently, targeted different populations, and developed within different political conditions. The point is not that every atrocity is secretly the same. The point is that Germany should not be used as a scapegoat through which United States history disappears. The most immediate comparison for the United States is the United States. There is a terrible intimacy inherent at the heart of the song, The Devil's Backbone. It is not a song about failing to recognize the sinner. It is about recognizing them completely and begging to keep them anyway. And perhaps that is the question the United States has never stopped asking of itself. What do we do when the thing we love was raised along the devil's backbone? When its freedom was purchased through captivity? When its home was built upon stolen land? When the nation running from judgment is also the nation we are trying to bring home? The United States has spent centuries pleading for mercy without offering confession, asking history not to take the country away while refusing to name what the country has done. We protect the sinner by turning crime into heritage. We call conquest expansion, extraction prosperity, domination is order. We call the violence necessary because admitting it was chosen would require us to choose differently now. But love is not the same as absolution. You cannot have something by hiding the bodies beneath its floorboards. You cannot redeem a nation by insisting that its wounds were inflicted by someone else. And you certainly can't straighten the devil's backbone by wrapping it in a flag. The astrology does not condemn us to reenact the past. It shows us where the old bones were structured. Neptune asks us which story we are willing to believe. Uranus asks us what must be broken open. And Mars asks us, what are we prepared to do? This is a lesson in liberation versus disruption. Two words often linked to Uranus. What the prisoner views as liberation, the country, the ruling class, the enslaver will always view as disruption to their fragile hold on power. The propaganda has convinced us, a lot of us, to side with the enslaver simply because disruption is bad. And history asks whether we will once again protect the sinner from consequence or love this country enough to demand its transformation. Because perhaps bringing America home does not mean returning it to what it was. Perhaps it means carrying it somewhere it has never been, somewhere beyond the backbone, somewhere beyond where the truth no longer has to beg for mercy, disrupting the truth of the ruling class is one of the first steps to liberation from enslavement. And thus concludes The Devil's Backbone. I hope this was informative, enjoyable. I hope that there is conversation to be had and taken from this, and liberation within the individual that could be accessed through this. As always, I love you all, and until next time, I'll see you in the stars.